The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the sand-colored hull of the M1A2 Abrams tank as it crested the ridge. Dust billowed behind the 68-ton war machine, creating a golden halo in the morning light. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, Captain Frank "Iron" Sherman squinted through his commander's sight, his weathered hands steady on the controls despite the violent rocking of the vehicle. At 58, he was twice the age of most tank commanders in the field, but none could match his instincts. "Contact. 2 o'clock, 1,600 meters," he announced, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. T-90 analog, stationary. Below him, Specialist Jenkins, his gunner, slewed the turret smoothly toward the target. The mock enemy tank, actually an old M60 dressed up to resemble a Russian design, sat partially concealed behind a low berm. Most crews would have missed it, but Sherman had been hunting tanks since before Jenkins was born. "Target acquired," Jenkins confirmed. "Fire when ready." The laser rangefinder pinged, the fire control computer made its calculations, and the gun stabilization system compensated for their movement, all in less than a second. The gunner squeezed his trigger. "On the way," Jenkins called. No actual round left the barrel. This was a training exercise at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. But sensors registered the hit immediately. In a real battle, a depleted uranium sabot round would have just turned that enemy tank into a funeral pyre. "Target destroyed," Sherman confirmed, scanning for new threats. "Driver, adjust course heading 230. Let's flank their second echelon before they realize what's happening." Sherman felt a familiar surge as Corporal Rodriguez guided the massive vehicle down the slope. A display showed the positions of the other 3 tanks in his platoon, following his lead like a well-choreographed dance. This was his element, the culmination of 35 years in armor. From the obsolete M60 Pattons he'd first trained on as a young lieutenant to the technological marvel he commanded now, tanks had been his life's dedication. The radio crackled. "Iron Horse 6 to all Iron Horse elements. Execute envelopment over." Sherman keyed his mic. "Iron Horse 2-6 copies. Executing flanking maneuver with platoon." He directed his platoon with minimal radio chatter. A tap on the shoulder here, a hand signal there. His crew responded like extensions of his own body. Despite the technological sophistication of modern warfare, Sherman knew that victory still came down to the human element. Training, instinct, and the unspoken bond between men who entrusted their lives to each other. Within 20 minutes, his platoon had bypassed the enemy's main defensive line and attacked from an unexpected direction. The opposing force never saw them coming. 5 simulated kills, no losses. As Sherman's tank emerged from behind a ridgeline to catch an enemy command post unprotected, he allowed himself a rare smile. Even after all these years, the thrill of outthinking an opponent never diminished. The exercise controller's voice broke through on the command net. All units, end exercise, end exercise, end exercise. Assemble at grid reference Quebec Echo 457-921 for debrief." Sherman acknowledged the order and instructed his driver to head toward the assembly area. As they traveled, he popped his hatch to stand in the commander's position, feeling the hot desert air against his face. The vast expanse of the Mojave stretched before him, its harsh beauty a fitting backdrop for the machines of war that trained here. Dust devils swirled in their wake, ephemeral monuments to their passing. At the assembly area, Sherman climbed down from his tank with practiced ease, despite knees that protested more with each passing year. He removed his CVC helmet, revealing close-cropped gray hair and a face weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines of experience. The younger officers gathered around him, hungry for his assessment. Even the OPFOR commander, a major with combat experience in Afghanistan, approached with respectful deference. "Captain Sherman," the major began, "that was some of the finest tactical maneuvering I've seen in years. You caught us completely off guard." Sherman nodded, accepting the compliment with quiet dignity. "Your defensive setup was textbook. Sometimes the textbook needs a new chapter." The after-action review proceeded, with Sherman offering pointed but constructive criticism to both sides. He didn't waste words or sugarcoat his assessments, but neither did he tear down unnecessarily. The men and women gathered around him listened attentively, knowing that his insights came from decades of experience and countless hours studying armor tactics from World War II through the Gulf Wars. As the debrief concluded, a staff sergeant approached with a satellite phone. "Captain Sherman, sir. Priority call from the Pentagon." A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. Calls from the Pentagon during a training rotation were rare and seldom brought good news. Sherman took the phone and walked a few paces away for privacy. "Sherman," he answered. The voice on the other end belonged to General Wallace Maxwell, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, a man Sherman had known since they were both lieutenants. "Frank, I need you in Washington, tomorrow morning, my office, 0800. "Sir, we're in the middle of a training rotation. I've got—" "Already cleared with your commander," Maxwell cut in. "There's a helicopter waiting to take you to Nellis. From there, you'll catch a military transport to Andrews." Sherman's jaw tightened. "What's this about, Wallace?" A pause. "Not over this channel, but I'll tell you this. It's important enough to pull you out of the field, and it might just be the most significant task of your career." The line went dead, leaving Sherman staring at the phone. In 35 years of service, he'd received exactly 3 calls that had pulled him from training or operations. Each one had changed the course of his life. He returned the phone to the waiting sergeant. "It seems I'm leaving. Lieutenant Rodriguez will take command of the platoon for the remainder of the exercise." Within an hour, Sherman was aboard a UH-60 Blackhawk, watching Fort Irwin recede into the distance, his duffel hastily packed with bare essentials. The abrupt departure left him uneasy. He had been 6 months from mandatory retirement, looking forward to it with a mixture of dread and resignation. Whatever Maxwell wanted, it had just upended his carefully structured final chapter. The helicopter's rhythmic beating matched the pounding in his temples as he tried to make sense of the summons. Maxwell wasn't one for dramatics. If he said this was significant, then the situation was serious indeed. Night had fallen by the time Sherman boarded the C-37 transport at Nellis Air Force Base. As the aircraft climbed into the darkening sky, he closed his eyes, not to sleep but to quiet his mind. Sleep would elude him tonight, as it often did. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Fallujah, 2004. The grinding urban combat, the constant threat of IEDs, the ambushes. His tank platoon had been attached to a Marine infantry unit clearing the city block by bloody block. The memory that always returned first was of a roadside bomb that had disabled the lead tank. He could still hear the screams of the driver as flames engulfed the lower hull, still feel the heat on his face as he pulled the man from the burning wreck. Sherman opened his eyes, forcing the memories back into their compartment. He had become expert at this mental discipline, not suppressing the trauma, but controlling when and how he revisited it. The nightmares still came, especially around anniversaries, but they no longer controlled him. The aircraft cabin was dimly lit, with only a few other passengers, military officers and civilian contractors, scattered throughout. None attempted conversation, for which Sherman was grateful. He needed this time to prepare, though for what, he couldn't say. His thoughts turned to Lisa, his wife of 30 years, gone now for 3. Cancer had taken her with a swiftness that still left him breathless when he allowed himself to dwell on it. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. He had been deployed when she first noticed the symptoms, commanding a tank company in Afghanistan. By the time he received emergency leave, the disease had spread throughout her lymphatic system. "Don't you dare feel guilty," she had told him during their final days together. "I've been a soldier's wife my whole adult life. I knew what I signed up for." Her courage at the end had humbled him. Sherman pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and removed a small photo. Lisa, at 35, sitting on the front porch of their quarters at Fort Hood, her smile radiant despite the Texas summer heat. He traced her face with his fingertip, a ritual performed countless times. Then there was Scott, their only child, now a lieutenant with his own tank platoon stationed in Germany. The boy had his mother's eyes and, unfortunately, his father's stubborn streak. Their relationship had been strained since Lisa's death. Scott blamed him, not for her illness, but for the decades of absences, the missed birthdays, the school events attended by his mother alone. There was truth in the accusation that Sherman couldn't deny. "Captain Sherman," a young Air Force lieutenant interrupted his reverie. "We'll be landing at Andrews in about 20 minutes, sir." Sherman nodded his thanks and returned the photo to his wallet. Whatever Maxwell had in store, he would face it as he had faced every challenge in his career. Head on and without complaint. That was the Sherman way, his father's way before him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of military service, each man shaped by the conflicts of his time. The lights of Washington appeared below, a constellation of human creation spread across the darkness. The nation's capital always felt alien to Sherman. He preferred the directness of the battlefield to the Byzantine politics of the Pentagon. Yet here he was, summoned like a modern Cincinnatus from his plow. After landing, he was met by a staff car and driven to temporary quarters near the Pentagon. The sparse VOQ room suited him fine. He had never required luxury, had never really adapted to civilian comforts even during his brief periods between deployments. He placed his duffel on the standard issue bed and checked his watch. 2,300 hours. 9 hours until his meeting with Maxwell. Sleep came fitfully as expected. He woke at 0500, completed his physical training routine, modified now for his aging joints but still rigorous by most standards, showered and dressed in his Class A uniform. The ribbons and badges that adorned his chest told the story of a career spent in harm's way. Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge, and dozens more. The Pentagon's massive structure loomed before him as the staff car approached at precisely 0730. 5 concentric rings, 5 floors, nearly 30,000 personnel, a bureaucratic fortress dedicated to the administration of American military might. Sherman had always found it ironic that the headquarters of the world's most powerful fighting force was essentially an office building filled with paperwork and meetings. Security was tight, as always, but his credentials and the expected visitor notifications smoothed his path. By 0750, he was being escorted through the labyrinthine corridors by a sharp-looking sergeant major who moved with purpose and precision. "Right through here, sir," the sergeant major indicated, stopping outside a nondescript door. "The general is expecting you." Sherman entered without hesitation. Inside, he found not just Maxwell, but a full conference room of senior officers and civilian officials. Their conversations halted abruptly at his entrance, and all eyes turned toward him. Maxwell, a barrel-chested man with a shock of white hair, rose from his seat at the head of the table. "Frank, thank you for coming on such short notice." He gestured to an empty chair to his right. "Please join us. We've got a situation that requires your particular expertise." Sherman took the offered seat, noting the tension that permeated the room. Gentlemen, ma'am," he acknowledged the assembly with a nod. "I'm at your disposal." Maxwell didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What I'm about to share is classified top secret SCI. It doesn't leave this room." He tapped a control and the lights dimmed as a projection screen descended from the ceiling. 3 weeks ago, we completed a classified vulnerability assessment of our current tank fleet. The results were concerning. The screen displayed a technical diagram of the M1A2 Abrams, with certain areas highlighted in red. "Our intelligence suggests that several potential adversaries have developed new anti-tank weapons specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in our armor." Sherman studied the diagram, immediately recognizing the implications. "The frontal glacis and turret ring," he observed. "They've found a way through our composite armor." "Not just that," a civilian in an expensive suit interjected. Sherman recognized him as Dr. Adrian Foster from DARPA. "They've developed a 2-stage penetrator that can defeat our depleted uranium mesh as well. Initial estimates suggest we could lose 60% of our tanks in the opening days of a near-peer conflict." Maxwell nodded grimly. "But that's only part of the problem." He changed the display to show a spreadsheet. "This is the current operational readiness of our tank fleet. The numbers here are the official report. 288 M1A2 SCP-3 tanks currently in inventory across all units." He tapped again, and a second spreadsheet appeared beside the first, with significantly different figures. "And this is the actual combat-ready status as of last week. Only 120 tanks fully operational. The rest are awaiting parts, undergoing maintenance, or serving as training platforms." The revelation struck Sherman like a physical blow. He knew that readiness had suffered during the focus on counterinsurgency operations, but this was far worse than he'd imagined. Nearly 60% of America's main battle tank fleet existed only on paper. "How has this happened?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. A full colonel from the logistics command cleared his throat. "Budget constraints, maintenance backlogs, supply chain issues. We've been cannibalizing parts from some tanks to keep others running. The pandemic disrupted production lines that were already strained. And frankly, tanks haven't been a funding priority since we pivoted to counterterrorism 20 years ago." Sherman's jaw clenched. He had seen this pattern before. the cyclical neglect of conventional warfare capabilities when the immediate threat receded. It had happened after Vietnam, after the Cold War, and now again after Iraq and Afghanistan. "So why am I here?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Maxwell exchanged glances with Foster before responding. "We're initiating a crash program to address both problems simultaneously. We're calling it Project Steel Bullet. It has two objectives: restore our tank fleet to full operational status and develop a modification package to counter these new threats." He fixed Sherman with a steady gaze. "And we want you to lead it." The room fell silent, all eyes on Sherman. He maintained his composure despite the surprise coursing through him. "General, with all due respect, I'm a field officer, not an acquisition specialist, and I'm 6 months from mandatory retirement." "Which is precisely why you're perfect for this," Maxwell countered. "You've commanded tanks in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've trained more armor officers than anyone currently on active duty. You know these machines inside and out." He leaned forward. "And most importantly, you have nothing to lose. You're not angling for promotion or worried about political fallout." Foster nodded in agreement. "Captain Sherman, we need someone who will tell us the unvarnished truth, not what we want to hear. Your reputation precedes you in that regard." Sherman considered their words carefully. He had been preparing himself mentally for retirement, for the difficult transition to civilian life that had defeated so many of his colleagues. Now they were offering him a purpose, a final mission of consequence. "How long?" he asked. "We need initial results in 6 months. Full implementation within 18, Maxwell replied. "Your retirement would be delayed under a special retention clause." Sherman's mind raced through the implications. 18 more months of service, 18 months of purpose before facing the void of retirement, but also 18 months of crushing responsibility, of navigating Pentagon politics, of fighting bureaucratic battles instead of tactical ones. "What resources would I have?" he inquired, already beginning to frame the problem tactically. Maxwell smiled slightly, recognizing that Sherman was engaging with the challenge. "Full authority to assemble your team, priority access to testing facilities at Aberdeen, a direct line to me for cutting through red tape." He slid a folder across the table. "The details are all in here, including your new orders and the preliminary vulnerability assessment." Sherman opened the folder, scanning the contents quickly. The technical details were sobering. The new threats weren't just theoretical. They had been demonstrated in classified testing. American armor superiority, a cornerstone of military doctrine since World War II, was in jeopardy. "There's one more thing you should know," Maxwell added, his tone grave. "The 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team is deploying to Eastern Europe next month as part of our enhanced forward presence. They'll be taking 60 of our operational tanks with them. If a conflict erupts, they'll be the first to face these new weapons." Sherman looked up sharply. "The 2nd Brigade includes the 367 armor, doesn't it?" Maxwell nodded slowly. "Yes, it does. I'm aware that your son's platoon is part of that battalion. It wasn't a factor in selecting you for this assignment, but I felt you should know." The information landed like a hammer blow. Scott's unit would be on the front line, potentially facing weapons specifically designed to defeat their armor. The abstract threat suddenly became intensely personal. Sherman closed the folder with deliberate care, his decision made. "I'll need complete access to the maintenance records for every tank in the inventory, and I want to personally inspect the production facilities at Lima." His voice was steady, revealing none of the turmoil beneath. "And I'll need to handpick my team." Maxwell nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Done. You'll have an office here, but I assume you'll want to base operations at Aberdeen?" "Correct. I need to be where the tanks are, not shuffling papers in the Pentagon." Sherman stood, signaling his readiness to get started. "If there's nothing else, General, I'd like to review these documents in detail before assembling my team." "Of course." Maxwell rose as well, extending his hand. "Thank you, Frank. The nation may never know about this work, but it could save thousands of lives if we face a near-peer conflict." As the meeting concluded and Sherman was escorted to a secure reading room to study the classified materials, the weight of his new responsibility settled on his shoulders. This would be his final battle, not fought with cannon and machine gun on some distant battlefield, but here at home with spreadsheets and test results as his weapons. And the stakes couldn't be higher. His son's life and the lives of thousands of other American soldiers hung in the balance. The secure reading room was Spartan but functional. A table, chair, and reinforced walls designed to prevent electronic eavesdropping. Sherman spent hours absorbing the vulnerability assessments, technical specifications, and intelligence reports. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. The new Russian Kornet EM and Chinese HJ-12E anti-tank guided missiles had been specifically engineered to target the Abrams' known vulnerabilities. They used tandem warheads, the first to trigger reactive armor or active protection systems, the second to penetrate the main armor. More concerning were reports of a new Russian ammunition type for the T-14 Armada's main gun, designed to defeat the depleted uranium inserts in the Abrams' frontal armor. By late afternoon, Sherman had compiled a list of immediate questions and potential approaches. He would need ballistics experts, materials scientists, combat veterans, and logistics specialists, and he would need them quickly. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. A young lieutenant entered, saluted, and handed him a secure tablet. "Sir, General Maxwell thought you might want to start reviewing personnel files for your team. These are the available candidates with relevant expertise." Sherman thanked him and began scrolling through the dossiers. Most were career acquisition officers or engineers with impressive credentials but little or no combat experience. He flagged a few possibilities but kept searching for people who understood both the technical and tactical dimensions of the problem. One name caught his attention: Lieutenant Colonel Elaine Carter, an MIT-educated mechanical engineer who had also served as a tank company commander in Iraq. Her performance evaluations were stellar, but he noted a common theme in the comments: not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, and can be abrasive when advocating technical solutions. Perfect. She had the education to understand the engineering challenges and the combat experience to grasp the stakes. Next, he found Master Sergeant Roy Donovan, a 30-year veteran maintenance specialist nicknamed Wrench. His file noted that he had been offered a commission multiple times but had declined, preferring to stay hands-on with the equipment. Currently stationed at the Army tank plant in Lima, Ohio, he had literally helped build hundreds of Abrams tanks and knew every bolt and circuit. Sherman continued through the files, adding names to his list. Captain Miguel Ortiz, a weapons systems officer who had recently completed advanced ballistics training. Lieutenant James Blackwood, a digital systems specialist who understood the Abrams' increasingly computerized fire control and defensive systems. By evening, he had identified his core team, a diverse group with complementary skills and experiences. What united them was a combination of technical expertise and practical battlefield knowledge. He sent his selections to Maxwell with a request for immediate transfer orders. With that task complete, Sherman left the Pentagon for his temporary quarters. The weight of the day's revelations hung heavy on him as he walked through the parking lot. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, a reminder that the seasons changed regardless of human concerns. In his quarters, he unpacked the few personal items he had brought: a framed photo of Lisa, his well-worn copy of Rommel's infantry attacks, and a small wooden box containing his accumulated medals and badges. He placed Lisa's photo on the nightstand, where he could see her face before sleeping and upon waking. Sherman removed his uniform jacket and sat heavily on the bed, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the fatigue that had been building throughout the day. Not just physical exhaustion, but the bone-deep weariness that came from confronting an enormous challenge with inadequate resources and limited time. He checked his watch: 2,100 hours in Washington, which made it 0300 in Germany. Too late to call Scott, even if their relationship hadn't been strained. Besides, what could he say? That his son might be heading into combat with vulnerable equipment? That the tanks Scott and his men trusted with their lives had critical flaws that potential adversaries were prepared to exploit? Instead, Sherman reached for his laptop and composed an email that revealed nothing of his new assignment, but expressed a father's concern and love disguised as professional interest. He asked about Scott's unit's readiness, mentioned some tactical suggestions based on his own experience, and closed with a simple, "Stay safe, Dad." It was the most personal communication they had shared in months. After sending the email, Sherman pulled out his phone and found himself scrolling to another contact. Rebecca Winters, a civilian military historian he had met at a conference the previous year. They had shared a couple of dinners when professional paths crossed, nothing more, but she had become someone he could talk to about matters that few civilians understood. His thumb hovered over her name for a long moment before he put the phone away. Not tonight. There would be time for personal connections after he had this situation under control. Sleep eluded him as his mind continued processing the day's information, developing and discarding approaches to the problems before him. The maintenance backlog alone would require months to address, and that was before considering the armor vulnerability issues. Sherman rose from his bed and went to the window, looking out at the Capitol's illuminated monuments gleaming in the distance. Washington always looked its best at night, he thought, when the grand ideals represented by those marble edifices weren't obscured by the messy reality of daily politics. By morning, he had formulated his initial approach. After a quick breakfast and several cups of strong coffee, he was back at the Pentagon, meeting with Maxwell to finalize the team's selections and arrange transportation to Aberdeen Proving Ground. Your team should be assembled within 48 hours, Maxwell informed him. I've put a hold on all their current assignments. Dr. Foster from DARPA will meet you at Aberdeen tomorrow to discuss technological solutions. Sherman nodded. I'll need access to at least 2 operational tanks for initial testing, preferably ones configured identically to those deploying with the 2nd Brigade. Already arranged, there's a secure facility at Aberdeen set aside for your project. Maxwell hesitated, then added, there's significant interest in this at the highest levels, Frank. The Secretary of Defense will be expecting weekly progress reports. He'll get them when there's progress to report, Sherman replied evenly. I won't waste time on briefings that could be spent solving the problem. Maxwell smiled slightly. I expected nothing less. That's why I wanted you for this. He extended his hand. Good luck, Frank. We're all counting on you. Sherman shook the offered hand firmly. We'll get it done, sir. By that afternoon, Sherman was aboard a military helicopter bound for Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The facility had been the Army's primary testing center for vehicles and weapons since 1917. Its 17,000 acres providing ample space for everything from ballistic testing to long-range artillery firing. As the helicopter descended toward the landing pad, Sherman gazed out at the sprawling test ranges and technical buildings below. This would be his battlefield for the next 18 months, a fight against time, bureaucracy, and physics rather than human adversaries. In some ways, it would be the most challenging deployment of his career. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump. As Sherman disembarked, a small group awaited him, standing at a respectful distance from the helicopter's rotor wash. He recognized Lieutenant Colonel Carter immediately, tall, African-American, with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years proving herself in male-dominated environments. Beside her stood a stocky, graying man in civilian clothes, who could only be Master Sergeant Donovan, his weathered face suggesting decades spent working in harsh conditions. The others, Ortiz, Blackwood, and several support personnel, formed a rough semicircle behind them. As Sherman approached, they saluted with parade ground precision. He returned the salute crisply, then relaxed his posture slightly. At ease, he instructed. I'm Captain Frank Sherman. Most of you know why we're here, but I'll make it clear for everyone. Our mission is to ensure that American tanks remain the most survivable and lethal fighting vehicles on the battlefield. We have 18 months to identify and correct critical vulnerabilities while simultaneously addressing maintenance backlogs affecting 60% of our tank fleet. He looked each team member in the eye as he continued. This isn't a conventional assignment. We'll be working directly with industry, challenging existing procedures, and likely stepping on some bureaucratic toes. If you're not comfortable with that, now is the time to say so. No one spoke. Sherman nodded, satisfied. Good. Lieutenant Colonel Carter will serve as Deputy Project Lead. Master Sergeant Donovan will oversee all technical aspects of the Maintenance Recovery Program. Captain Ortiz will lead vulnerability assessment and ballistic testing. Lieutenant Blackwood will handle digital systems integration. He checked his watch. It's 15:30 now. Get settled in your quarters, review the preliminary materials, and be ready for our first full briefing at 0800 tomorrow. Dismissed. As the team dispersed, Carter remained behind. A word, sir? Walk with me, Colonel, Sherman suggested, heading toward the main technical building. Once they were out of earshot of the others, Carter spoke frankly. I've reviewed the preliminary vulnerability data, sir. It's worse than most people realize. The new Russian tandem penetrators don't just defeat our current armor, they exploit its composition. The ceramic inserts that work so well against conventional rounds actually become a liability against these new weapons. Sherman appreciated her directness. Your assessment matches mine. What's your background with composite armor systems? 3 years at the Army Research Laboratory before my combat deployment, then 2 more after I returned. I've studied every major armor system in service, including classified variants. She hesitated before adding, I've also developed some theoretical alternatives that were considered too radical for implementation. This piqued Sherman's interest. Radical how? They challenged fundamental assumptions about armor composition and arrangement. My proposals involved non-uniform layering and geometric disruption of penetrator formation. The acquisition command thought the manufacturing complexity wasn't worth the potential gains. Her tone remained professional, but Sherman detected an undercurrent of frustration. Well, Colonel, I think it's time to revisit those radical ideas. The stakes have changed. They reached the technical building, a modern 4-story structure of glass and concrete that housed laboratories, simulation centers, and administrative offices. Inside, they found a suite of rooms designated for Project Steel Bullet, already equipped with secure computers, technical workstations, and a central conference area. This will do, Sherman approved. Make sure everyone has the security clearances and access they need. I want to hit the ground running tomorrow morning. As Carter left to handle the administrative details, Sherman found himself alone in what would serve as his office for the duration of the project. He unpacked his few belongings, arranging them with military precision on the desk. Lisa's photo took its place of honor, her smile a reminder of what was at stake beyond the technical challenges, the human lives that depended on his success. The phone on his desk rang, and he answered crisply. Sherman. Captain, this is Dr. Foster from DARPA. I've just arrived at Aberdeen and wanted to coordinate our meeting for tomorrow. 0800 in the main conference room, Doctor. I'll need your team's latest assessments of the Russian and Chinese penetrator technologies. You'll have them. There's something else you should know. Foster's voice lowered slightly. There's been some resistance to this project at higher levels. Certain elements within the Defense Department believe we should be focusing resources on next-generation systems rather than updating existing platforms. Sherman had expected this. The military-industrial complex always preferred developing expensive new systems to improving existing ones. Noted, but my orders come directly from General Maxwell with the Secretary's approval. Of course. I just thought you should be prepared for the political dimension of this work. Foster paused. I look forward to our collaboration, Captain. Your reputation precedes you. After ending the call, Sherman turned to his computer and accessed the secure personnel database. He typed in his son's name. Lieutenant Scott Sherman, 367 Armor, currently stationed in Grafenwohr, Germany. The system showed his status as active duty, deployment pending. Nothing Sherman didn't already know. He hesitated, then entered another search parameter, pulling up the specific tank assignment for his son's platoon. 4 M1A2 SCP-3 Abrams, assigned to Scott's platoon, were among those scheduled for the European deployment. Sherman accessed the maintenance records for each vehicle, scrutinizing them with a professional eye. What he found disturbed him. 2 of the 4 tanks showed recent component replacements using parts cannibalized from other vehicles. One had gone nearly 18 months without a full depot-level maintenance cycle. These machines, including the one his son would command, were being held together with stopgap measures and overextended maintenance intervals. Sherman sat back in his chair, the reality of the situation sinking in with new personal urgency. His son would soon be positioned near a potentially hostile border, commanding a tank with deferred maintenance and vulnerable armor, facing an adversary with weapons specifically designed to defeat it. The abstract mission had just become intensely personal. This wasn't just about national security or military readiness, it was about ensuring his son came home alive. The professional and the personal had converged in a way Sherman had never experienced in his long career. He closed the maintenance records and opened a new document. In precise, methodical fashion, he began outlining his approach to the dual challenges before him, restoring the fleet's operational readiness and addressing the armor vulnerabilities. Both would require innovative thinking, relentless effort, and the courage to challenge entrenched procedures. As the evening deepened outside his window, Sherman continued working, fueled by coffee and determination. The technical challenges were formidable but not insurmountable. The bureaucratic obstacles would be harder to overcome. The inertia of a massive organization resistant to rapid change, the competing priorities of various stakeholders, the inevitable budget constraints. But Frank Sherman had spent his career overcoming obstacles. From his first days as a young tank commander, facing Soviet-built armor in Desert Storm, to leading counterinsurgency operations in urban Iraq, he had always found a way to accomplish the mission. This would be no different. Just his final battle, fought with different weapons on a different field. By midnight, he had completed his initial assessment and action plan. Tomorrow, he would present it to the team and begin the real work. Sherman shut down his computer and prepared to leave for his temporary quarters in the officers' housing area. As he reached for his cover, his gaze fell once more on Lisa's photograph. "I'll keep him safe," he promised quietly. "Whatever it takes." Outside, the autumn night was clear and cool, with stars visible above the lights of the proving ground. Sherman walked alone across the nearly empty grounds, his footsteps echoing on the concrete. In the distance, he could make out the silhouettes of tanks, parked in neat rows, waiting for the next day's testing. Those steel behemoths had been his life for 35 years, his profession, his passion, his purpose. Now, in what should have been the twilight of his career, they had given him one final mission of consequence. Sherman straightened his shoulders and continued toward his quarters, already mentally preparing for the challenges that awaited him at dawn. The tank commander had his orders. The battle was about to begin. Dawn broke over Aberdeen Proving Ground, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. Captain Frank Sherman stood at the window of the conference room, watching as the first rays of sunlight glinted off the hulls of the tanks arranged in neat rows on the testing field. His first full day leading Project Steel Bullet was about to begin, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the armor of the very machines he'd spent his life commanding. Behind him, his hastily assembled team filed into the room. Lieutenant Colonel Carter took position at his right hand, her posture military perfect, but her eyes betraying fatigue from a night spent reviewing technical documents. Master Sergeant Donovan slouched into a chair, a large thermos of coffee clutched in his weathered hands like a lifeline. Captain Ortiz and Lieutenant Blackwood followed, along with Dr. Foster from DARPA and his two civilian engineers. Sherman turned from the window, surveying the team with a practiced eye. These were the people upon whom the lives of thousands of soldiers, including his son, would depend. "Good morning," he began without preamble. "By now you have all reviewed the preliminary assessment documents. Our mission has two components: address the critical armor vulnerabilities in our current Abrams fleet and restore operational readiness to acceptable levels." He activated the digital display on the conference table, bringing up technical schematics of the M1A2 Abrams. "Dr. Foster, please brief the team on the specific vulnerabilities we're facing." Foster rose, his civilian suit a stark contrast to the uniforms around him. "As you know, the Abrams was designed during the Cold War to defeat Soviet tank rounds. Its composite armor, particularly the depleted uranium mesh in the frontal glacis and turret face, has proven nearly impenetrable to conventional kinetic energy penetrators." He tapped the display, highlighting specific areas of the tank. "However, our adversaries have been studying these tanks for decades. They've developed a new generation of tandem charge penetrators specifically designed to defeat our armor. The first charge disrupts the composite layers, while the second delivers a concentrated penetrating jet through the compromised section." Ortiz leaned forward, studying the diagrams. "How effective are these new weapons in testing?" "Against current Abrams armor configurations, penetration success rates exceed 70% at standard combat engagement distances," Foster replied grimly. "The Russians have already deployed limited numbers of these weapons to their advanced units. The Chinese are close behind." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sherman let it linger, allowing the implications to sink in. Then he addressed the second issue. "Master Sergeant Donovan, your assessment of the fleet's current maintenance situation?" Donovan set down his coffee, his weathered face grim. "It's a mess, sir. We've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, pulling parts from one tank to keep another running, deferring depot-level maintenance, using components beyond their service life." He pulled up maintenance records on the display. "Of our 288 tanks, only 120 are fully mission-capable right now. Another 100 or so could be made operational within 30 days with proper parts and maintenance. The rest," he shrugged, "some are little more than shells being used for training or waiting for parts that never arrive." "How did we get here?" Blackwood asked, the youngest member of the team looking genuinely shocked. "Budget priorities," Sherman answered. "For 20 years we focused on counterinsurgency operations. Tanks weren't needed for fighting insurgents in mud huts. Programs got cut, maintenance schedules extended. The defense industry pivoted to producing MRAPs and drones. He faced the team squarely. But now near-peer competition is back, and we're not ready. "So what's the plan, sir?" Carter asked, the question everyone was thinking. Sherman activated his own presentation. "We work both problems simultaneously. Colonel Carter will lead the vulnerability assessment and solution development team. Master Sergeant Donovan will head the readiness restoration effort." He highlighted a calendar on the display. "We have 6 months to develop initial solutions, 18 months for full implementation." He turned to Carter. "I want your team focused on a 2-track approach. First, immediate modifications we can implement to the current fleet that will at least partially mitigate these new threats. Second, a more comprehensive redesign for long-term protection." Carter nodded. "I already have some ideas about non-uniform armor configurations that could disrupt penetrator formation." "Good. Donovan," Sherman continued, "your priority is getting as many tanks operational as possible. Start with the units slated for deployment to Europe. If necessary, I want you to cannibalize the training fleet to ensure that every tank heading overseas is 100% mission capable." "That'll piss off the training commands, sir," Donovan noted without emotion. "Better to have angry instructors than dead tank crews," Sherman replied. "Dr. Foster, I need your team to liaise with both groups. Your labs have the most current data on enemy capabilities and the most advanced material science. Make sure we're designing to defeat not just today's threats, but tomorrow's as well." As the meeting continued, Sherman laid out specific responsibilities, timelines, and resources. By 0900, the team was breaking up to begin their assigned tasks. Sherman remained in the conference room with Carter, reviewing her initial armor modification concepts. "These are promising approaches," he acknowledged, studying her diagrams. "But manufacturing and retrofitting will be a challenge. We need solutions we can implement in the field, not just in a factory." Carter nodded. "I understand, sir. We'll prioritize field deployable modifications first." She hesitated before adding, "There's another issue we should discuss. The current reactive armor packages we use as add-ons to the Abrams were designed for a different threat profile. They're virtually useless against these new penetrators. Recommendations? We need to develop a new generation of reactive armor specifically designed to disrupt these tandem charges. I have some theoretical models, but we'll need to fast-track testing and production." Sherman considered this. "Draft a proposal by end of week. I'll take it directly to General Maxwell. If it shows promise, we'll get the resources." As Carter gathered her materials, she asked the question that had been lingering since the project began. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Always, Colonel." "Why you? You mentioned you're close to retirement. There are younger officers with technical backgrounds who could have led this project. Why did Maxwell pull you in?" Sherman met her gaze steadily. "Because I have no career to protect, Colonel. I can tell uncomfortable truths without worrying about my next promotion. And because I've spent 35 years in tanks, I know how they fight, how they demasamish and die, and how the men inside them think." He paused. "Maxwell needs someone who will put the lives of those tank crews above politics, procurement cycles, and budget considerations." Carter nodded slowly. "Thank you for your candor, sir. One more thing, Colonel. My son commands a tank platoon in the 367 Armor. They're among those deploying to Europe next month." Understanding dawned in Carter's eyes. "I see, sir. That's personal motivation." "It is, but I want to be clear. We're working to protect every tank crew, not just my sons." Sherman gathered his own materials. "Let's get to work. We're already behind schedule." The first week passed in a blur of activity. Sherman divided his time between the armor testing facility, where Carter's team was already running computer simulations of new armor configurations, and the maintenance depot, where Donovan had established what he called tank triage to assess and prioritize repairs to the fleet. On day 8, Sherman drove out to Lima, Ohio, home of the Army tank plant operated by General Dynamics Land Systems. The massive factory complex had been producing American tanks since 1941, from the M4 Sherman of World War II to today's Abrams variants. As the staff car approached the facility, Sherman felt a sense of connection to the generations of tankers who had come before him, men who had faced their own technological challenges and overcome them. Inside the plant, he met with the production managers and engineering team, explaining the urgency of their mission without revealing classified details. The plant had been operating at reduced capacity for years, with periodic shutdowns whenever orders ran low. Now Sherman needed them to ramp up production of both new components and replacement parts. The funding authorizations will come through official channels, he assured the plant director. But I need your team to begin preparations immediately. When the orders arrive, I want you ready to move at full capacity. The director, a former tank commander himself, nodded understanding. We'll be ready, Captain. Most of our workforce has been with us through multiple slowdowns. They'll be glad to get back to full production. Sherman spent the day touring the facility, from the foundry where hull components were cast to the final assembly line where the massive vehicles took shape. The scale of industrial effort required to build a single tank never ceased to impress him. 68 tons of steel, composites, and electronics, each vehicle requiring thousands of man-hours to assemble. As he watched workers installing a power pack into a partially completed hull, his phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Scott, a reply to the email he had sent days earlier. Dad, thanks for the tactical advice. We're busy preparing for deployment. Equipment status concerning 2 of my platoon's tanks down with maintenance issues, replacement parts back-ordered, trying to get them operational before we ship out. We'll call when I can, Scott. Brief and professional, with just enough personal content to acknowledge their relationship. The message confirmed what Sherman already knew. The maintenance issues plaguing the fleet were directly affecting his son's unit. It strengthened his resolve to push Donovan's readiness team even harder. That evening, in his temporary quarters at a hotel near the plant, Sherman placed a call to General Maxwell. Frank, how's it going out there? Maxwell answered without preamble. Progress on both fronts, but we need to cut through some red tape, Sherman replied. I need emergency procurement authority for the Lima plant. They're ready to increase production, but the current contracting process will take months. I'll have to go to the secretary for that. Then do it. Every day we wait, more tanks fall below readiness standards. Sherman's voice was firm. I also need your help with the training commands. Donovan is pulling parts from their tanks to support the deployment fleet, and they're pushing back. Maxwell sighed audibly. I'll handle the training command. As for the procurement authority, I'll see what I can do. The bean counters are already asking questions about where the money's coming from. Tell them it's coming from the same place we'll find money for body bags if we don't fix this problem, Sherman said bluntly. A long pause followed. I'll call you tomorrow with an answer, Maxwell finally responded. Keep pushing, Frank. The next 2 weeks saw incremental progress. Donovan's maintenance teams had managed to return 15 tanks to operational status by working round-the-clock shifts and expediting parts from the Lima plant. Carter's armor team had begun physical testing of modified panels at the Aberdeen ballistics range, with promising early results. But challenges multiplied alongside advances. Supply chain issues delayed critical components. Bureaucratic resistance slowed approvals for test procedures, and lurking beneath it all was a sense that time was running out. Intelligence reports indicated that Russian forces were conducting exercises near NATO's eastern borders, using their newest equipment, including the very weapons designed to defeat American tanks. 4 weeks into the project, Sherman called his core team together for a progress assessment. The mood in the conference room was tense. Everyone understood they weren't moving fast enough. Status reports, Sherman began. Colonel Carter, you first. Carter activated the display, showing high-speed camera footage of ballistic tests. We've developed a prototype modification to the existing armor package that shows promise. By adding a disruption layer designed to fragment incoming penetrators, we've reduced penetration rates from 70% to approximately 45% in laboratory conditions. That's still unacceptably high, Sherman observed. Yes, sir, but it's a significant improvement, and the modification can be implemented in the field with relatively simple tools and training. We can't make these tanks invulnerable, but we can make them much harder to kill. She switched to another slide. Our more comprehensive solution of involving a complete redesign of the armor package shows even greater promise, but would require factory-level modifications. Sherman nodded. Donovan readiness status? The master sergeant looked tired, the lines in his face deeper than when they'd started. We've returned 38 tanks to fully operational status, sir. Another 22 should be ready within 2 weeks. But we're running into parts bottlenecks. The Lima plant is ramping up, but they're still months away from full production capacity. What's your assessment of the deployment fleet? Donovan grimaced. The 2nd Brigade tanks are prioritized, but we're still going to be cutting it close. At current pace, we'll have all 60 deployment tanks operational 3 days before they're scheduled to ship out. That's not acceptable, Sherman said firmly. We need a buffer for unexpected issues. Dr. Foster, what's the latest intelligence on the threat deployment timeline? Foster looked uncomfortable. Our latest assessment suggests Russian units equipped with the new anti-tank weapons have moved to forward positions. They're conducting what they call routine exercises, but the positioning is consistent with preparation for potential limited operations. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If hostilities erupted, American tanks would be facing these new weapons sooner than anyone had anticipated and with inadequate protection. We need to accelerate, Sherman said finally. Colonel Carter, I want your field modification kits ready for deployment within 30 days. We'll retrofit the tanks in Europe if necessary. Sir, we haven't completed full testing. I understand the risks, Colonel, but half-protected tanks are better than unprotected ones. Donovan, I want maintenance crews working 3 shifts, 7 days. Pull in contractors if you need to. Foster, get your DARPA team to prioritize the disruption layer materials. I need production quantities, not lab samples. As the meeting concluded, Sherman felt a familiar tension, the pressure of command decisions where all options carried risk. Move too quickly, and they might deploy inadequately tested solutions. Move too slowly, and they might miss the window to protect deployed forces altogether. That night, Sherman finally made the call he'd been postponing. He dialed Rebecca Winter's number, needing to speak with someone outside the chain of command, someone who might offer perspective without military or political constraints. Frank, she answered, surprise evident in her voice. It's been a while. Too long, he admitted. I apologize for dropping out of contact. Military necessity, I assume? Your emails have been deliberately vague lately. Sherman allowed himself a small smile. Rebecca was perceptive. She understood operational security without needing explanation. Something like that, I can't discuss details, but I'm leading a critical project with significant time pressure. And you're calling me at 10:30 at night because? Because I need a sounding board who isn't part of the military hierarchy or defense establishment. He paused. And because I've missed our conversations. There was a moment of silence before she replied, her tone softening. I've missed them too, Frank. What's on your mind, whatever you can share, that is. Sherman chose his words carefully, avoiding classified information while conveying the essence of his dilemma. I'm in a situation where I need to decide between deploying an imperfect solution quickly or waiting for a better solution that might come too late. Lives depend on this decision, Rebecca, including my son's. Scott's involved in this. The concern in her voice was immediate. Indirectly, his unit will be affected by my decisions. Sherman rubbed his eyes, fatigue evident in the gesture even though Rebecca couldn't see it. The professional calculation is straightforward. Deploy the partial solution now. But as a father, I keep second-guessing myself. Rebecca considered this. Frank, in all the historical research I've done on military leadership, one thing stands out. The best commanders make decisions based on the information available, not the information they wish they had. You've always been that kind of leader. Trust your instincts. And if my instincts are clouded by personal concerns, then recognize that and compensate for it. But don't paralyze yourself with doubt. Her voice was steady, reassuring. The Frank Sherman I know would make the same decision whether it was his son or someone else's in harm's way. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on personal matters as well as the philosophical aspects of command responsibility. By the time they said goodnight, Sherman felt more centered, more certain of his path forward. Rebecca had that effect on him, helping him sort through the tangle of thoughts without telling him what to think. The next morning, Sherman issued the order. Carter's team would finalize their field modification kit within 3 weeks for immediate deployment to Europe. Simultaneously, they would continue development of the more comprehensive armor solution for later implementation. It was a compromise between speed and thoroughness, but one that balanced the competing demands of his mission. As the project accelerated, Sherman maintained a grueling schedule, dividing his time between Aberdeen, Lima, and Washington. He slept little, ate when remembered, and pushed himself as hard as he pushed his team. The stakes were too high for anything less than total commitment. 6 weeks into the project, a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Lieutenant Blackwood, the digital systems specialist, was requested an urgent meeting. Sir, he began, uncharacteristically animated, I've been analyzing the fire control software for the Abrams, looking for ways to improve target acquisition against threats equipped with these new weapons. Sherman nodded. Go on. What if we approach this from a different angle? Instead of just trying to improve the armor, what if we enhance the tank's ability to neutralize these threats before they can fire? Blackwood brought up a simulation on his tablet. I've modeled a software update that would prioritize targeting of known anti-tank weapon platforms based on thermal and visual signatures. The simulation showed an Abrams identifying and engaging enemy anti-tank teams at extended ranges before they could bring their weapons to bear. This would give our tanks first-shot advantage against these specific threats, Blackwood explained. Combined with Colonel Carter's armor modifications, it could significantly reduce vulnerability. Sherman studied the simulation carefully. How quickly could this be implemented? The software update could be deployed via secure digital distribution to all operational Abrams within 2 weeks. The limiting factor would be training crews on the new targeting protocols. Work with Colonel Carter to integrate this into the overall protection strategy, Sherman ordered. I want a comprehensive briefing ready by Friday. If this performs as well as your simulation suggests, it could be a game changer. The digital enhancement approach proved promising in initial testing. While it wouldn't help against main gun rounds from enemy tanks, it could significantly reduce vulnerability to man-portable anti-tank weapons, the more numerous threat in most combat scenarios. Sherman authorized immediate development for deployment alongside Carter's armor modifications. As Project Steel Bullet passed the 2-month mark, progress was evident on multiple fronts. 47 tanks had been returned to fully operational status. The Lima plant had resumed full-shift production of critical components. Carter's armor modification kits were in final testing, showing consistent 40 to 50% reduction in penetration success rates. And Blackwood's targeting enhancement software was ready for field trials. But political headwinds were strengthening. General Maxwell called with troubling news. Frank, we've got a problem in Washington. General Reynolds is lobbying against Project Steel Bullet. Sherman frowned. Reynolds headed the Future Combat Systems Directorate, responsible for developing next-generation weapons platforms. On what grounds? He's arguing that modifying the Abrams is throwing good money after bad. Says we should accelerate development of the next-generation tank instead. He's got allies in Congress and among defense contractors who stand to benefit from new procurement rather than upgrades. That platform is at least a decade from operational deployment, Sherman countered. What does he expect us to do in the meantime? Leave our current tank force vulnerable? I know that and you know that, but Reynolds has a persuasive argument for those who don't understand the technical realities. Maxwell sounded tired. He's scheduled a briefing with the Armed Services Committee next week. I need you to prepare a counterpoint presentation. Hard data, Frank. Show them why this project is essential as a bridging solution. I'll be there, Sherman promised, and I'll bring evidence they can't ignore. The political challenge required Sherman to divert attention from technical matters to prepare his congressional testimony. He worked with Carter and Foster to compile compelling data on the threat assessment, the vulnerability of current tanks, and the effectiveness of their proposed solutions. He included detailed cost comparisons showing how their approach would provide immediate protection at a fraction of the cost of developing an entirely new platform. The night before his Washington testimony, Sherman received an unexpected call. The caller ID showed Lieutenant Scott Sherman. Scott, he answered, surprised. Good to hear from you. Hey, Dad. His son's voice was clear despite the transatlantic connection. Got a moment to talk? For you? Always. Sherman set aside his briefing materials. How are preparations going? That's partly why I'm calling. Our deployment has been accelerated. We ship out next week instead of next month. Scott's tone was professional, but Sherman could detect the underlying tension. We're still having equipment issues. 2 of my platoon's tanks have transmission problems, and the parts haven't arrived. Sherman frowned. The accelerated deployment timeline changed everything. I'll look into it immediately. Your unit is priority 1 for equipment readiness. Thanks, Dad. Scott hesitated. I heard through the grapevine that you're leading some kind of crash program for tank improvements. Anything I should know before we deploy? Sherman measured his response carefully. There are some modifications coming your way once you're in theater. They'll improve survivability against newer threat weapons. Make sure your crews get the training package when it arrives. He couldn't say more without breaching security protocols, even to his son. "Will do." Another pause. "Dad, I know we haven't been close since Mom died. That's on me as much as you. But I want you to know I've always respected what you do, the men you've trained, the standards you've set. I try to live up to that every day." The unexpected words caught Sherman off guard, touching something deep within him. "Thank you, son. That means a lot." He cleared his throat. "Your mother would be proud of the officer you've become. I know I am." "I've got to go. Final briefings before pack-out," Scott said. "I'll write when I can. Stay safe out there. Trust your training and your instincts." "I will. Goodbye, Dad." After the call ended, Sherman sat motionless, absorbing the implications of the accelerated deployment. 2nd Brigade, Scott's unit, would be in Europe before Carter's armor kits or Blackwood's software were ready for deployment. They would face potential threats with unmodified equipment. He picked up the phone again and called Donovan. "Master Sergeant, I need a status update on the 367 armor maintenance issues. Lieutenant Sherman just informed me their deployment has been moved up." Donovan checked his records. "Not good news, sir. Those transmission assemblies are still at least 4 days out. We've tried to expedite, but..." "Not acceptable," Sherman cut in. "I want those parts on a military transport tomorrow. Find them wherever they exist in the inventory. If necessary, pull them from tanks at the National Training Center. That's going to require general officer authorization to override the allocation protocols. You'll have it within the hour." Sherman ended the call and immediately dialed Maxwell, explaining the situation in terse sentences. Maxwell understood immediately. "I'll sign the authorization myself, and Frank, I'll find out why this deployment was accelerated without coordination with our project. This shouldn't have happened." "Thank you, sir. I'm still coming to Washington tomorrow for the testimony, but I need to make a detour to Fort Hood first thing in the morning to check on the 367's equipment status personally." "Do what you need to do. I'll handle Reynolds and the committee until you arrive." Sherman spent the next hour reorganizing his schedule and issuing instructions to his team leaders. Then he packed for his trip, knowing he faced crucial battles on 2 fronts: the technical race to protect America's tanks and the political battle to ensure the program continued. He arrived at Fort Hood shortly after dawn, having taken a military transport that landed at the post's airfield. The sprawling Texas base was home to the 1st Cavalry Division, including the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team that housed Scott's battalion. The motor pool was a hive of activity as soldiers prepared vehicles for overseas shipment. Sherman identified himself to the sergeant major in charge, who immediately escorted him to where the 367 Armor's tanks were parked. "We're doing everything we can to get these vehicles ready, sir," the sergeant major explained, "but we're short on parts and time." Sherman examined the tanks with a professional eye. Their exteriors were clean and well-maintained, but that told him nothing about their mechanical condition. "Where's Lieutenant Sherman's platoon sergeant?" "Right over there, sir, Sergeant First Class Wilkins." Sherman approached the NCO, who was directing soldiers as they secured equipment to a tank's bustle rack. "Sergeant Wilkins, Captain Sherman, I understand you have transmission issues with 2 of your platoon's tanks." Wilkins straightened to attention. "Yes, sir, tanks 2-3 and 2-4. We've got parts on order, but they haven't arrived. We're trying to complete repairs before we ship out next week." "The parts will be here today," Sherman informed him. "I've arranged a priority shipment. What other issues is the platoon facing?" For the next hour, Sherman walked through each of the platoon's 4 tanks with Wilkins, noting deficiencies and ensuring that they were documented for immediate action. He was both a captain performing an inspection and a father making sure his son would have reliable equipment in harm's way. As they finished with the last tank, Sherman asked, "Where is Lieutenant Sherman now?" "Officers' briefing, sir, should be done around 1100. Sherman checked his watch. He needed to be on a flight to Washington by noon to make his testimony. "When you see him, tell him I stopped by. And Sergeant Wilkins," he fixed the NCO with an intense gaze, "take care of my son and his men over there." Wilkins nodded solemnly. "You have my word, sir." Sherman departed Fort Hood without seeing Scott, the demands of his mission pulling him toward Washington. On the flight, he finalized his testimony, organizing the data to present the strongest possible case for Project Steel Bullet. By the time he arrived at the Capitol, the Armed Services Committee hearing was already underway. General Reynolds was at the witness table, presenting sleek visuals of the future combat system, a hypothetical next-generation tank that existed only in computer renderings. The FCS will incorporate active protection systems, artificial intelligence targeting, and modular armor that can be rapidly reconfigured for different threats, Reynolds was saying. Rather than patching our obsolete Abrams fleet, we should accelerate development of this platform to regain our technological edge. Sherman slipped quietly into the hearing room, taking a seat in the back as Reynolds continued. The general's presentation was polished and persuasive, painting a picture of technological dominance that appealed to lawmakers eager to bring defense contracts to their districts. When Reynolds concluded, the committee chairman recognized Maxwell, who had been waiting his turn. General Maxwell, I understand you have a different perspective on our armored force modernization needs. I do, Mr. Chairman, and I've brought the officer leading our current upgrade initiative to provide specific details. Captain Frank Sherman is one of our most experienced tank commanders and now heads Project Steel Bullet. Sherman was called to the witness table, where he set up his own presentation materials. Unlike Reynolds' glossy conceptual images, Sherman's slides contained hard data, threat assessments, vulnerability analyses, readiness statistics, and cost projections. Distinguished committee members, he began, his voice steady and authoritative, America faces an immediate armored warfare crisis that cannot wait for future platforms. Our current tank fleet suffers from two critical vulnerabilities: maintenance backlogs that have rendered 60% of our tanks non-operational, and armor configurations that can be defeated by weapons already deployed by potential adversaries. He advanced through his presentation methodically, laying out the evidence without embellishment or exaggeration. When he reached the slide showing the projected deployment of Russian anti-tank weapons along NATO's eastern border, the room grew noticeably quieter. This threat exists today, not 10 years from now, Sherman emphasized. At this moment, American tank crews, including my own son's platoon, are preparing to deploy to Europe with vulnerable equipment. Project Steel Bullet offers immediate, cost-effective solutions to address both the readiness crisis and the protection shortfall. A congressman from Michigan interrupted. Captain Sherman, General Reynolds suggested that modifying the Abrams is merely prolonging the inevitable. Why not focus resources on the future combat system instead? Sir, the FCS is a promising concept, but it won't be deployable for at least a decade. Even under the most aggressive development timeline, we would face a critical capability gap of 8 to 10 years. Sherman met the congressman's gaze directly. I ask you to consider what you would tell the families of tank crews lost in that gap period because we focused on tomorrow's solution at the expense of today's protection. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Sherman continued, presenting the dual-track approach of Project Steel Bullet, immediate field modifications combined with deeper structural upgrades, all at a fraction of the cost of the FCS program. When the testimony concluded, the committee chairman thanked both officers for their presentations. We have difficult decisions to make regarding resource allocation, he acknowledged. Both immediate needs and future capabilities must be considered. We'll take your inputs under advisement as we finalize the Defense Authorization Bill. Outside the hearing room, Reynolds approached Sherman. The general was tall and imposing, with the polished appearance of an officer who had spent more time in the Pentagon than in the field. Impressive presentation, Captain. You make a compelling case for your project. His tone suggested professional courtesy rather than genuine admiration. Thank you, sir. I believe both approaches have merit. My concern is the protection gap while we develop next-generation platforms. Reynolds nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. The committee has limited resources to allocate, Captain. Supporting both programs fully may not be possible. He lowered his voice slightly. I understand your son is deploying with the 2nd Brigade. That must add personal motivation to your work. The implication was clear. Reynolds was suggesting that Sherman's judgment might be clouded by personal concerns. Sherman met the general's gaze evenly. Every tank commander is someone's son, General. My responsibility is to all of them. He maintained his professional demeanor despite the flash of anger he felt. If you'll excuse me, I need to return to Aberdeen. We have modification kits to finalize before the brigade deploys. As Sherman walked away, Maxwell fell into step beside him. Reynolds is a political animal, Frank. Don't let him get under your skin. I'm more concerned about his influence with the committee. If they shift funding from our project to FCS, we'll lose momentum at a critical time. I'll work my channels, Maxwell promised. You focus on the technical side, get those modifications ready for deployment. Sherman spent the flight back to Aberdeen reviewing data from Carter's latest armor tests. The results were encouraging. the modified panels were now consistently reducing penetration rates to below 40%, and in some configurations as low as 30%. Not perfect, but a significant improvement over the current vulnerability. Upon landing, he went directly to the testing facility, where Carter was supervising live fire evaluations of the final modification kit design. "How's it going, Colonel?" he asked, joining her in the armored observation bunker. Carter looked tired but satisfied. "See for yourself, sir." She gestured to the test rig, where a modified section of Abrams turret armor was mounted. A remote-controlled launcher was positioned to fire a test projectile designed to simulate the new Russian penetrator. "This is Test 37 with the finalized configuration," she explained. "So far, we've had 22 non-penetrations out of 36 attempts. That's a 39% penetration rate, down from 70+% with unmodified armor." Sherman watched as technicians prepared for the test. "When can we begin production of the modification kits?" "We're ready now. The materials are commercially available, and the installation process requires only basic tools and training. We prepared detailed instruction packages for field implementation." The test fired, sending the projectile into the armor panel at over 1,500 meters per second. High-speed cameras captured the impact in microscopic detail. When the smoke cleared, the armor panel showed significant damage, but the penetrator had failed to create a complete breach. "Another success," Carter noted, marking the result on her tablet. "Sir, with your authorization, we can begin shipping modification kits to Europe within 48 hours. "Make it 24, Sherman directed. "The 2nd Brigade deployment has been accelerated. I want those kits waiting when they arrive in theater." He turned to her. "Excellent work, Colonel. This will save lives." Carter acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "It's still not perfect. The protection is partial, and it adds weight to the vehicles that will affect mobility somewhat." "In combat, perfect is the enemy of good enough," Sherman replied. "This is good enough to deploy now while we continue working on better solutions for the future." From the testing range, Sherman proceeded to the Digital Systems Lab, where Blackwood was finalizing the targeting software upgrade. The lieutenant's workspace was cluttered with monitors displaying code sequences and simulation scenarios. "Status report, Lieutenant," Sherman requested. Blackwood looked up from his screens. "Final integration testing complete, sir. The software enhancement improves threat identification by 62% and reduces target acquisition time by nearly 40% against anti-tank teams." He brought up a simulation showing the system in operation. "We've also added an automated alert function that warns crews when they enter areas with high probability of anti-tank ambush based on terrain analysis." "Deployment timeline?" "The software package is ready for distribution. We can push it to deployed units via secure update servers. Crew training is the limitation. It's a 30-minute tutorial, but all personnel need to complete it before the system goes live." "Coordinate with Colonel Carter. I want both modifications deployed simultaneously." Sherman studied the simulation with approval. "Good work, Blackwood. Creative approach to the problem." The lieutenant smiled slightly, the first such expression Sherman had seen from the normally serious young officer. "Thank you, sir. Sometimes the best armor is not getting hit in the first place." Sherman's final stop was Donovan's maintenance facility, where the master sergeant was overseeing preparations of the last group of tanks scheduled for the European deployment. "Parts arrived at Fort Hood," Donovan reported without preamble. "The 367's tanks should all be operational in time for shipment." "And the rest of the brigade?" "We're at 89% mission capable. The remaining 11% should be ready within 48 hours, barring any new issues." Donovan wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "It's not pretty work, sir. We're still robbing parts from stateside units to make this happen. Eventually, that bill comes due." "I know," Sherman acknowledged. "But the Lima plant is ramping up production. Once they're at full capacity, we can start rebuilding the training fleet." Donovan nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "If the funding holds." "It will." Sherman spoke with more certainty than he felt, knowing that the political battle in Washington was far from decided. "Keep pushing, Master Sergeant. We're making progress." That evening, Sherman received a call from Maxwell. "The committee is leaning our way, Frank. Your testimony made an impression, especially when you personalized the stakes." "That wasn't my intent, sir. I was merely stating facts." "Sometimes facts need a human face to make them meaningful to politicians," Maxwell replied. "Regardless, it looks like we'll get continued funding for Project Steel Bullet, though perhaps not the full amount we requested. Reynolds got something for his future platform as well, a compromise that lets everyone claim victory. As long as we can deploy the modifications and restore fleet readiness, I can work with reduced funding, Sherman said. There's more, Maxwell continued. I've been authorized to tell you that the president has been briefed on your project. He's taking a personal interest in the readiness of our armored forces, particularly with the situation in Eastern Europe evolving. Sherman absorbed this news silently. Presidential attention could be either helpful or harmful, depending on the political winds. What's the timeline for the 2nd Brigade's arrival in Europe? He asked, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. Advance elements land in Germany next Tuesday. Main body, including the armored units, arrives Thursday and Friday. Maxwell paused. Frank, there's something else you should know. Russian exercises near the Polish border have intensified. Intelligence suggests they're testing their new anti-tank capabilities in realistic scenarios. The deployment of our forces, including the accelerated timeline, is a direct response to these activities. The implications were clear. The likelihood of American tanks facing these new threats in actual combat had increased significantly. Project Steel Bullet had suddenly become even more urgent. I understand, sir. We'll be ready. Sherman ended the call and immediately began checking on the status of the modification kit shipments. They needed to be in place before the tanks arrived in theater. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. Carter's team packaged and shipped the first batch of armor modification kits to U.S. bases in Germany. Blackwood finalized the software distribution package and coordinated with communications units to ensure secure delivery to deployed forces. Donovan's maintenance crews worked around the clock to complete preparations on the last remaining tanks for the 2nd Brigade. Sherman divided his time between all 3 efforts, pushing his team relentlessly while fighting bureaucratic battles to maintain momentum. He slept little and ate when remembered, driven by the knowledge that time was running critically short. 92 days after Project Steel Bullet began, Sherman stood on the tarmac at Dover Air Force Base, watching as the last elements of the 2nd Brigade boarded transport aircraft bound for Europe. Among them was Scott's company, their tanks already loaded on cargo planes the previous day. He had not seen his son. Operational security and the accelerated deployment schedule had prevented a face-to-face meeting. But they had spoken briefly by phone that morning. The modifications you mentioned, Scott had said. Word is they're waiting for us when we arrive. They are. Make sure your crews take the training as seriously. It could make the difference. Will do, Dad. A pause. Is it as serious as they're making it sound in the briefings? Sherman had considered sugarcoating the situation but decided his son deserved the truth. It's serious, Scott. The Russians have weapons specifically designed to defeat our tanks, and they're positioning them near where you'll be operating. The modifications will help, but they're not a perfect solution. You'll need to be extra vigilant. Understood. We'll adapt and overcome, right? Isn't that what you always taught me? That's right, Sherman had replied, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and concern. Trust your training and your crew, and come home safe. Now, as the last transport prepared for takeoff, Sherman stood at attention, rendering a salute to the departing troops. Whether they knew it or not, they carried with them not only his professional best efforts, but his deepest personal hopes. As the aircraft disappeared into the clouds, Sherman lowered his hand slowly. Phase 1 of Project Steel Bullet. Getting the initial modifications deployed was nearly complete, but much work remained, implementing the more comprehensive armor upgrades, restoring the full fleet to operational status, and developing the next generation of protection systems. His phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Carter. Modification kits arrived in Ramstein, installation team standing by. First modified tanks will be ready when crews arrive. A small victory, but a significant one. Sherman texted back a simple acknowledgement, then turned toward his waiting staff car. The driver held the door as he entered, then asked, "Back to Aberdeen, sir?" Sherman nodded, already reviewing mental notes for the next phase of the project. "Yes, and quickly, please. We still have a lot of work to do." As the car pulled away, Sherman gazed out the window at the empty tarmac. The first battle, getting modifications deployed before the troops arrived in theater, had been won. But the larger war ensuring American armor remained dominant on future battlefields was just beginning. Project Steel Bullet was entering its most critical phase, and Frank Sherman, tank commander and father, was determined to see it through to success. Too many lives, including his sons, depended on it. 4 a.m. at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Captain Frank Sherman stood alone on the test range, watching the first hint of dawn creep across the eastern sky. Steam rose from the coffee cup in his weathered hands, dissipating into the cool autumn air. 3 months into Project Steel Bullet, and the weight of command had etched deeper lines into his face. Sleep had become a luxury he could rarely afford. Behind him, the silhouette of an M1A2 Abrams tank sat in quiet majesty against the pre-dawn glow. Tomorrow, they would test the latest iteration of Carter's comprehensive armor upgrade, a complete redesign that promised to reduce vulnerability by over 70%. If successful, it would provide the long-term protection their deployed tanks desperately needed. Sherman's phone vibrated in his pocket. At this hour, it could only be important news. The caller ID showed EUCOM secure. Sherman, he answered, tension evident in his voice. Captain, this is Colonel Andrews, J3 Operations at European Command. The voice was professionally crisp. We've had an incident involving elements of the 2nd Brigade. Sherman's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of incident? During a training exercise near the Polish border, a platoon from 367 Armor encountered what they initially believed was a simulated opposing force. It turned out to be Russian Special Operations troops conducting a reconnaissance on our side of the border. Scots Battalion. Sherman forced himself to maintain professional composure. Casualties? Negative. No shots fired. The Russians withdrew when challenged, claiming they were lost during an exercise. But we obtained imagery of their equipment. A pause. They were carrying the new Cornet EM systems we've been concerned about. And Captain, the platoon involved was Lieutenant Sherman's. The revelation landed like a physical blow. His son had come face to face with the very threat Project Steel Bullet was racing to counter. Is his unit equipped with the new armor modifications? Affirmative. The installation was completed 72 hours ago. The software update is also operational. Andrews hesitated. Sir, there's more. Intelligence indicates increased Russian activity all along the border. We're elevating alert levels for all forward deployed units. I thought you should know, given your project's importance to our posture. Thank you, Colonel. Keep me informed of any developments. Sherman ended the call and stood motionless, absorbing the implications. The encounter might have been coincidence, but his instincts told him otherwise. The Russians were testing American reactions, probing for weaknesses, and they had specifically encountered his son's platoon, the unit whose tanks were among the first to receive the new protective measures. He dialed General Maxwell immediately. Frank? Maxwell answered, his voice thick with sleep. It's not even 5 a.m. I just got a call from EUCOM. Russian Special Forces with Cornet systems made contact with elements of 367 Armor, specifically my son's platoon. Maxwell was instantly alert. Casualties? None. They withdrew when challenged. But the implications are clear. They're actively probing our capabilities, possibly trying to assess whether we've addressed the armor vulnerability. I'll contact the Secretary immediately, Maxwell replied. In the meantime, accelerate the testing of the comprehensive armor package. If things escalate, we'll need to deploy the full solution sooner than planned. Understood. I'll notify Carter and the team. By sunrise, Sherman had assembled his core leadership in the project's command center. The mood was tense as he briefed them on the developing situation in Europe. This changes our timeline, he concluded. Colonel Carter, how soon can we complete validation testing on the comprehensive armor upgrade? Carter frowned, calculating rapidly. We're scheduled for final ballistic testing tomorrow. If all goes well, we could begin limited production within 2 weeks. But full implementation across the deployed fleet would take months. We may not have months, Sherman turned to Blackwood. Lieutenant, what's the status on version 2 of the targeting software? The enhanced algorithm shows 90% threat identification improvement in simulations, sir. But we need field testing to validate the real-world performance. Sherman nodded, mentally adjusting the project timeline. Dr. Foster, I need DARPA to expedite the active protection system integration. Can your team have a functional prototype ready within 10 days? Foster looked uncomfortable. Captain, normal testing protocols would require at least 30 days of evaluation before... We don't have 30 days, Doctor. Our tanks are facing these weapons now. Sherman's voice carried the unmistakable tone of command. I need solutions that work today, not perfect solutions next month. The scientist nodded reluctantly. We'll do our best, sir. 10 days for a functional prototype. Donovan, Sherman continued, turning to the Master Sergeant. Where do we stand on fleet readiness? 67% of total inventory is now mission capable, sir. That's up from 42% when we started. But we're still critically short on power packs and stabilization systems. Prioritize components for the European fleet. If this situation escalates, those units will be our first line of defense. Sherman swept his gaze across the assembled team. We've made extraordinary progress in 3 months. Now we need to do the impossible. I want the comprehensive armor solution ready for initial deployment within 3 weeks. Understood? A chorus of affirmations answered him, though the expressions around the table reflected the daunting nature of the challenge. As the team dispersed to their respective tasks, Sherman remained behind, studying the map of Eastern Europe displayed on the main screen. The location of his son's unit was marked with a small blue icon near the Polish border, perilously close to concentrations of Russian forces. Carter lingered after the others had left. Sir, permission to speak freely? Always, Colonel. The armor solution we're testing tomorrow is promising, but it still only addresses part of the vulnerability. These new Russian weapons are designed to defeat even advanced composite armor. She hesitated. I've been working on a more radical approach in my limited spare time. It's unorthodox, but the simulations suggest it could reduce penetration rates to below 15%. Sherman's interest was immediately piqued. What kind of approach? A non-uniform, geometrically complex armor arrangement that creates unpredictable deflection patterns, combined with reactive elements that disrupt the penetrator's formation before impact. She pulled up technical diagrams on her tablet. The challenge is that it requires complete redesign of the frontal glacis and turret face. It's not something we can retrofit in the field. Sherman studied the designs carefully. This is the outside-the-box thinking we need, Colonel. How quickly could we implement this if we had full production priority at Lima? With expedited manufacturing, Carter calculated quickly, perhaps 60 days from approval to first unit delivery, but that would require overriding normal acquisition protocols. Draft a formal proposal immediately. I'll take it directly to Maxwell this afternoon. Sherman handed back the tablet. This could be the long-term solution we've been searching for. The day passed in a blur of activity. Sherman divided his time between the test preparation facility, where technicians were making final adjustments to the armor package scheduled for testing the next morning, and conference calls with EUCOM and Pentagon officials regarding the developing situation in Europe. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly concerning picture. Russian armored units were conducting exercises less than 50 kilometers from NATO's eastern border. Strategic bombers were flying patrol patterns just outside Alliance airspace. And most troubling, the specialized anti-tank units equipped with the new Cornet EM systems had been observed moving to forward positions under the cover of routine training. By evening, Sherman was preparing for an urgent video conference with the Secretary of Defense when his phone rang. The caller ID read Lieutenant Scott Sherman. Scott, he answered, relief evident in his voice. Good to hear from you. Hey, Dad. His son's voice sounded steady, professional. I figured you'd have heard about our little encounter by now. I got the official report this morning. Are you all right? We're fine, just a brief standoff. They backed down as soon as we took up defensive positions. Scott paused. I wanted to let you know, those modifications you sent over? My gunner says the new targeting system spotted their weapons before we could see them with the naked eye. Gave us valuable early warning. Pride mingled with relief in Sherman's chest. That's exactly what it was designed to do, and the armor upgrades? No way to know for sure without taking fire, which thankfully didn't happen. But my crew feels more confident knowing we're better protected than we were. Another pause. The word here is that tensions are escalating. My platoon has been moved to forward alert status. Sherman chose his words carefully, balancing his roles as father and officer. Stay vigilant. These new Russian systems are designed to engage at extended ranges. Use terrain masking whenever possible, and rely on your targeting system's early warning capability. Will do. I should go. We're on 2-hour readiness alert. Scott. Sherman hesitated. I'm proud of you, son. You're handling this situation exactly as you should. Trust your training and your instincts. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. The connection ended, leaving Sherman staring at the silent phone. The conversation with his son weighed heavily on Sherman's mind as he joined the video conference with Defense Secretary Harris, General Maxwell, and several other senior officials. The secretary's expression was grave as he outlined the latest intelligence assessment. Gentlemen, we're facing a calculated test of NATO resolve. Russian forces are positioned for what they're calling enhanced training exercises. But our intelligence suggests they're actually preparing for a limited incursion into NATO territory. specifically the Baltic states or eastern Poland. Maxwell interjected, "Their goal appears to be testing our response capabilities and the effectiveness of their new anti-tank weapons against our armor." Secretary Harris nodded grimly. "Which brings us to Project Steel Bullet. Captain Sherman, what's the status of your protective measures?" Sherman provided a detailed briefing on the project's progress. The field modifications already deployed, the comprehensive upgrade scheduled for testing tomorrow, and Carter's new advanced design concept. The immediate modifications have reduced vulnerability by approximately 40%, he explained. The comprehensive package should increase that to 65%. Colonel Carter's advanced concept could potentially reach 85%, but would require complete manufacturing retooling. The Secretary considered this information. "So our deployed tanks are somewhat better protected than they were 3 months ago, but still vulnerable to these new weapons." "Yes, sir. The modifications improve survivability significantly, but don't eliminate the threat entirely." "What do you need to accelerate deployment of the comprehensive solution?" Sherman was prepared for this question. Emergency production authority for the Lima plant, expedited parts procurement, and most importantly, airlift capacity to transport the upgrade kits to Europe as they become available. "You'll have it," the Secretary decided. "General Maxwell, issue the necessary orders. I'll sign the authorization within the hour." He turned his attention back to Sherman. "Captain, the President has been briefed on your project. He's authorized me to convey his personal interest in your success." The meeting continued with discussions of force posture, diplomatic initiatives, and contingency plans. When it concluded, Sherman found himself alone with Maxwell on the secure line. "Frank, I've never seen the Secretary move so quickly on procurement authorities," Maxwell observed. "The situation is more serious than they're letting on in the briefings. Intelligence suggests the Russians might attempt a limited probe of NATO defenses within the next week, essentially testing their new anti-tank capabilities against our Abrams under combat conditions." Sherman absorbed this sobering assessment. "Our deployed tanks need better protection, and they need it now. I'm going to personally oversee tomorrow's testing. If the comprehensive armor package performs as expected, I want production to begin immediately." "I'll make it happen," Maxwell promised. "Whatever you need, you'll have it." The next morning dawned clear and cold at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Sherman arrived at the test range before sunrise, reviewing final preparations with Carter and the ballistics team. The modified Abrams sat ready, its frontal armor and turret face completely reconfigured with the new composite panels and reactive elements. "We'll conduct 3 test series," Carter explained, as technicians prepared the test equipment. "First, standard kinetic energy penetrators at various angles and velocities. Second, shape charges similar to traditional RPGs. And finally, the simulated Russian tandem charge penetrators, the ones specifically designed to defeat our current armor." Sherman nodded, studying the tank with a critical eye. "The additional weight affects mobility?" "Minimal impact. Less than 3% reduction in acceleration and top speed. The improved protection more than compensates for the slight performance decrease." The first test series proceeded flawlessly. The modified armor defeated every standard penetrator, even at point-blank range and optimal impact angles. The shape charge test showed similar success, with only 1 partial penetration out of 15 attempts. But the critical test involved the simulated Cornet EM projectiles. These sophisticated weapons represented the gravest threat to American tanks, the very reason Project Steel Bullet existed. As technicians prepared the test apparatus, Sherman felt the tension rise among the observers. This was the moment of truth. The first simulated Cornet round slammed into the modified glacis plate at over 1,700 meters per second. High-speed cameras captured the impact in microscopic detail, the initial charge detonating against the outer layer, the main penetrator forming and driving toward the inner armor, and then fragmenting as it encountered the complex, non-uniform layers Carter had designed. "No penetration," the range officer confirmed. A second round struck the turret face with similar results. Then a third aimed at the vulnerable junction where the turret met the hull. Again, no penetration. By the 8th test firing, the pattern was clear. The comprehensive armor upgrade was defeating the simulated Russian weapons consistently. Not perfectly, 2 of the 14 rounds achieved partial penetration, but the improvement was dramatic. 86% effectiveness, Carter announced, her usual professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal genuine pride. That's better than our projections. Sherman clasped her shoulder briefly. Outstanding work, Colonel. This will save lives. He turned to the communications officer. Contact General Maxwell immediately. Tell him the comprehensive upgrade exceeded expectations. We're ready to begin production. The next hours were a whirlwind of activity. The successful test results triggered the Emergency Production Authority's Secretary Harris had approved. The Lima plant shifted to round-the-clock operations, with the first production armor kits scheduled for completion within 10 days. Military transport aircraft were placed on standby to ferry the upgrades to Europe as soon as they became available. Meanwhile, Foster's team at DARPA accelerated development of the Active Protection System, a network of sensors and countermeasures designed to detect and neutralize incoming projectiles before they struck the tank. Combined with the improved armor and Blackwood's enhanced targeting software, it represented a comprehensive approach to protecting American tanks from the Russian threat. 4 days after the successful armor test, Sherman was reviewing production schedules in his office when Maxwell called with alarming news. Frank, we've got a situation developing. Russian forces have conducted what they're calling a tactical repositioning exercise. That's placed significant armored elements within 15 kilometers of the Polish border. NATO has elevated alert levels for all forward deployed units. Sherman felt his stomach tighten. The 2nd Brigade? They've been moved to defensive positions near Suwalki. Your son's battalion is part of the forward screen. Maxwell's voice was grave. Intelligence suggests this is more than just posturing. The Russians have deployed their new anti-tank units prominently, almost as if they want us to see them. They're showcasing their capabilities, Sherman concluded, trying to demonstrate that they can neutralize our armor advantage. That's the assessment. The question is whether they'll cross the line from demonstration to actual engagement. Maxwell paused. Frank, I've spoken with the Secretary. We're expediting deployment of the comprehensive armor upgrades to the forward units. The first shipment leaves Lima tonight on military transport. I need you to personally oversee the installation in Europe. The request caught Sherman off guard. Sir, I can be more effective coordinating from Aberdeen. Your team is performing admirably, but this installation needs to happen quickly and correctly. The technical crews in Europe need your expertise on the ground. Maxwell's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. There's a C-17 waiting for you at Andrews. Wheels up in 3 hours. Sherman understood the unspoken message. As the project leader and an experienced tank commander, he was the logical choice to oversee the critical upgrade deployment. But they both knew there was another reason. His son was among the tankers whose lives might depend on these modifications being installed correctly. I'll be ready, sir. The flight to Ramstein Air Base in Germany took nearly 9 hours. Sherman used the time to review installation protocols and coordinate with Carter's team, who would continue testing and refinement at Aberdeen. He also studied the latest intelligence reports on Russian deployments and capabilities, looking for patterns that might reveal their intentions. Upon landing, he was met by Colonel James Richardson, commander of the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team. Captain Sherman, Richardson greeted him as they walked briskly toward a waiting helicopter. Your timing is good. The situation is evolving rapidly. Status of the 367 armor? Sherman asked, catching himself. Forward deployed near the Polish-Lithuanian border. They're screening our main defensive positions. Richardson's expression was grim. We've detected increased electronic warfare activity from the Russian side. They're probing our communications and targeting systems. The helicopter lifted off, banking toward the east. The first shipment of upgrade kits arrived 2 hours ago, Richardson continued. We've established a forward maintenance area 20 kilometers behind the front line. Your technical teams are already there preparing for installation. How many tanks can we upgrade simultaneously? With the equipment and personnel available 8 at a time, we're rotating platoons back from the front on a staggered schedule. Richardson hesitated. Captain, I understand your son commands a platoon in 367. I want you to know he's performing exceptionally under pressure. His unit is scheduled for upgrade rotation tomorrow morning. Sherman nodded, maintaining professional composure despite the surge of paternal concern. Thank you, Colonel. I'll do everything possible to ensure all your tanks receive the best protection we can provide. The helicopter touched down at the forward maintenance area as dusk was settling across the Polish countryside. The facility had been hastily established in an abandoned factory complex with camouflage netting stretched above to shield it from aerial observation. Inside, Sherman found a hive of activity, mechanics and technicians unpacking armor components, preparing tools, and studying installation diagrams. Master Sergeant Donovan approached as Sherman entered, his weathered face showing surprise. "Captain, didn't expect to see you in theater, sir." "Direct orders from Secretary," Sherman explained. "How are preparations going?" "First 4 tanks arrive in 30 minutes. We've got the installation protocols down, but I'm concerned about the time factor. Book says 12 hours per tank. We need to cut that in half." Sherman surveyed the workspace, his experienced eye noting inefficiencies in the layout. "Reorganize into 2-stage processing. First team removes the existing armor panels, while the second prepares the upgrade components. We can reduce turnaround to 6 hours that way." Donovan nodded appreciatively. "Good thinking, sir. I'll implement immediately." Throughout the night, Sherman worked alongside the technical crews, guiding the installation process and solving problems as they arose. His hands-on approach earned respect from the maintenance personnel, many of whom were surprised to find a senior officer in coveralls, deep in the mechanical intricacies of the upgrades. By dawn, the first 4 tanks had received the comprehensive armor package and were ready to return to their units. As they prepared to process the next group, Sherman received word that Lieutenant Sherman's platoon had arrived at the holding area, awaiting their turn in the maintenance facility. He walked out to meet them, maintaining a professional demeanor despite his desire to embrace his son. The 4 Abrams tanks sat in defensive positions, their crews performing maintenance while waiting their turn for upgrades. Scott spotted him approaching and climbed down from his commander's hatch. He saluted crisply. "Captain Sherman, sir, didn't expect to see you here." Sherman returned the salute. "Lieutenant, I'm overseeing the upgrade installation." He gestured toward the maintenance facility. "Your platoon is next in the rotation. The new armor package has performed exceptionally in testing. 86% effectiveness against the Russian penetrators." Scott nodded, professional in front of his men, but unable to hide the relief in his eyes. "That's good to hear, sir. We've had multiple visual contacts with their anti-tank teams across the border. They make sure we see them. Psychological operations, I suppose." "Likely so. Have you experienced any electronic warfare effects on your systems?" "Intermittent GPS degradation and some communications interference. Nothing we can't work around." Scott hesitated. "The word among the line units is that the Russians are preparing for some kind of limited probing action, possibly within the next 48 hours. Sherman had heard the same assessment from intelligence channels, but was surprised to find it circulating among the troops. "All the more reason to get your tanks upgraded quickly. Have your crews ready to move into the facility in 30 minutes. As Scott turned to relay the orders to his platoon sergeants, Sherman added quietly, "It's good to see you, son." A brief smile crossed Scott's face. "You too, Dad." The installation process for Scott's platoon proceeded smoothly, with Sherman personally inspecting each tank before it was declared complete. By late afternoon, all 4 vehicles had received the comprehensive armor upgrade, along with the latest version of Blackwood's targeting software. As the platoon prepared to return to their forward positions, Sherman provided a final briefing to the tank commanders. "The new armor configuration will significantly improve your protection against these Russian weapons, but it's not invulnerable. Maintain tactical discipline and use terrain masking whenever possible." He indicated specific areas on a tactical map. Their anti-tank teams prefer to engage from elevated positions at ranges between 1,000 and 2,500 meters. Your upgraded targeting systems should detect their thermal signatures before they can acquire you. Use that advantage. The commanders absorbed his guidance with the serious attention of men whose lives would depend on this information. As they dispersed to their vehicles, Scott lingered briefly. "The crews appreciate you coming out here personally," he said. "It means something, knowing the man who developed these upgrades cared enough to oversee the installation himself." Sherman nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant. The entire Project Steel Bullet team deserves the credit." Scott studied his father's face, noting the new lines of fatigue etched there. "You look tired, Dad. I'll rest when this crisis is resolved." Sherman glanced toward the eastern horizon where his son would soon be heading. "Be careful out there. Trust your training and your equipment." "I will." Scott hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thanks for everything, sir." Sherman grasped his son's hand firmly, wishing circumstances allowed for more than this brief moment. "Godspeed, Lieutenant." As Scott's platoon departed for their forward positions, Sherman returned to the maintenance facility to continue processing the next group of tanks. Throughout the night and into the following day, the upgrade operation continued at maximum tempo. By the end of the second day, 24 tanks had received the comprehensive armor package, approximately 40% of the brigade's Abrams fleet. Sherman was inspecting the latest installations when Colonel Richardson arrived with urgent news. Captain, we've received intelligence that the Russians are planning a demonstration exercise tomorrow at dawn, essentially a limited incursion across the border to test our response capabilities. Where? Sherman asked, immediately thinking of his son's position. The Suwalki area, right where your son's battalion is deployed. Richardson's expression was grim. They're specifically targeting our tank units with their new anti-tank systems. It appears they want to prove they can neutralize our armor advantage. Sherman absorbed this information, forcing himself to think as an officer rather than a father. Status of the upgrade deployment: 40% complete. We can process another 12 tanks before dawn, but that still leaves nearly half the brigade's Abrams with only the basic modification package. Prioritize the forward units, Sherman decided. Any tank in potential contact range needs the comprehensive upgrade immediately. Richardson nodded. Already done, but there's another issue. We're detecting increased electronic warfare activity. The Russians are jamming our tactical communications and degrading GPS signals in the border region. Have Blackwood's software updates been pushed to all operational tanks? Affirmative. The latest version includes countermeasures for their known EW capabilities. Sherman considered this situation. Colonel, I'd like to move forward to the Tactical Operations Center. I may be able to provide technical insight if their systems perform unexpectedly. Richardson hesitated. It's your call, Captain, but I should warn you, if hostilities commence, the TOC will be within artillery range. I understand the risk. My place is where I can be most effective. Within the hour, Sherman was en route to the Battalion Tactical Operations Center, a hardened command post situated in an abandoned factory building 5 kilometers behind the front line. Inside, staff officers monitored tactical displays showing the disposition of American and Russian forces across the border region. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harris, briefed Sherman on the current situation. Russian forces have been conducting night training exercises for the past 3 hours. We are tracking significant movement of their armored elements toward forward assembly areas here and here. He indicated positions on the tactical map. Their anti-tank units. Deployed along this ridgeline, Harris pointed to elevated terrain just inside Russian territory. Perfect firing positions with clear lines of sight to our forward elements. Sherman studied the map, recognizing the tactical situation immediately. The Russians had positioned their anti-tank units to engage NATO tanks across open terrain as they responded to any border incursion. It was a deliberate trap designed to showcase their new weapon systems against American armor. What's the current disposition of 367 armor? Harris indicated positions on the map. Alpha and Bravo companies are in hull-down positions along this ridge. Charlie Company, including your son's platoon, is positioned here as a tactical reserve. Sherman nodded, relieved that Scott's unit was not in the most exposed position. Have all these tanks received the comprehensive armor upgrade? Alpha and Bravo, yes. Charlie Company is scheduled for upgrade rotation tomorrow. The news struck Sherman like a physical blow. His son's platoon still had only the basic modification package, the one that reduced vulnerability by 40%, not the 86% offered by the comprehensive upgrade. Colonel, I recommend immediate repositioning of Charlie Company. Move them behind this terrain feature. Sherman indicated a low hill that would provide cover from the Russian firing positions. At minimum, have them adopt hull-down positions that minimize exposure to those anti-tank units. Harris studied the suggestion. Reasonable precaution. I'll issue the order immediately. Throughout the night, Sherman remained in the operations center, monitoring the developing situation and providing technical advice as needed. Reports from intelligence assets indicated continued Russian preparation for what they were now openly calling a tactical demonstration, scheduled to commence at dawn. At 0400, Sherman received an urgent message from Aberdeen. Carter had completed final testing on her advanced armor concept, the geometrically complex, non-uniform design that promised even greater protection. The results exceeded all expectations, 92% effectiveness against the Russian penetrators. Production can begin immediately, her message concluded. Lima plant is already retooling based on preliminary approval. Under normal circumstances, this would have been cause for celebration. The long-term solution to protect America's tank fleet was ready for implementation. But with Russian forces poised for potential action within hours, it provided little comfort for the immediate situation. At 0530, with first light beginning to appear on the eastern horizon, the operations center received reports of increased Russian activity. Reconnaissance drones detected armored vehicles moving into assembly areas. Electronic warfare activity intensified, degrading communications and sensor capabilities. "They're coming," Harris observed grimly. "Question is whether this will be a limited probe or something more substantial." Sherman studied the tactical display, noting the position of Scott's platoon. They had moved to the recommended hold-down positions behind the terrain feature, minimizing their exposure to the Russian anti-tank units. But if serious fighting erupted, they would inevitably be committed to the battle. At 0615, the first reports of contact came in. Russian armored reconnaissance vehicles had crossed the border at multiple points, advancing slowly while broadcasting messages claiming they were conducting training operations and had inadvertently entered NATO territory. NATO forces responded according to protocol, challenging the incursion and maneuvering to block further advance. The Russians halted just 2 kilometers inside NATO territory, maintaining positions while continuing to claim navigational error. "They're baiting us," Harris observed, "trying to draw our tanks into pre-sighted engagement areas." Sherman agreed. "Classic tactics. Their anti-tank units are waiting for targets of opportunity." For 2 tense hours, the standoff continued. Russian vehicles held their positions inside NATO territory while diplomatic channels worked furiously to resolve the misunderstanding. Behind the scenes, intelligence indicated the Russians were carefully observing NATO deployments, particularly the positioning of Abrams tanks. At 0845, the situation escalated. A Russian armored vehicle suddenly accelerated toward an American checkpoint, ignoring warnings to halt. When it finally stopped just 50 meters from American positions, its turret began rotating toward the NATO forces. "They're forcing our hand," Harris muttered. Sherman watched tensely as the tactical display showed American forces responding to the threat. Tanks from Alpha Company moved to support the checkpoint, exposing themselves to potential fire from the Russian anti-tank positions. For several minutes, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Then a single shot rang out. A Russian armored vehicle fired what they would later claim was an accidental discharge toward the American checkpoint. No one was hit, but the provocation demanded response. American forces returned fire, disabling the Russian vehicle. Within seconds, the encounter escalated as Russian anti-tank teams launched their first missiles at the exposed American tanks. The operations center fell silent as they awaited reports of the engagement results. Sherman held his breath, knowing the lives of American tank crews protected by his project's armor upgrades, hung in the balance. The first report came in from Alpha Company. Cornet impact on A-23, armor penetrated but minimal interior damage. Crew reports tank operational, returning fire. A second report quickly followed. Multiple impacts on A-15, no penetration, repeat, no penetration, tank continuing mission. As more reports flowed in, a pattern emerged. The comprehensive armor upgrade was performing as designed. Tanks that had received the full modification package were surviving hits from the Russian weapons, though not without damage. The protection wasn't perfect, but it was giving American crews the survivability they needed. Then came the report Sherman had been dreading. Charlie Company engaging Russian armor, attempting to flank a checkpoint. Lieutenant Sherman's platoon moving to blocking position. Sherman watched the tactical display as Scott's platoon maneuvered to intercept the Russian thrust. They were moving into a potential engagement area covered by Russian anti-tank teams. Teams armed with weapons specifically designed to defeat American tanks. For 15 agonizing minutes, Sherman monitored the situation as Charlie Company engaged the Russian forces. Reports of tank-to-tank combat flooded the command net, with American forces gradually gaining the upper hand against the numerically superior but less sophisticated Russian armor. Then came the dreaded call. Heat round impact on C-26. Tank commander reports partial penetration. Systems degrading, continuing engagement. C-26 was Scott's tank. Sherman felt his heart freeze as he waited for follow-up reports. Long seconds passed before the radio crackled again. C-26 to battalion. Tank operational but damaged. Continuing mission. We've eliminated 2 enemy vehicles and are pursuing survivors. Relief washed over Sherman like a physical wave. The basic modification package hadn't fully stopped the Russian weapon, but it had reduced its effectiveness enough to prevent catastrophic damage. Scott was alive, his tank still fighting. Over the next hour, the engagement gradually wound down. Russian forces withdrew across the border, claiming their incursion had been a navigational error during exercises. NATO commanders weren't fooled. This had been a deliberate test of Western resolve and capabilities. When the final tally came in, the results were sobering but encouraging. 8 American tanks had been hit by the new Russian anti-tank weapons. The 5 with comprehensive armor upgrades had survived with minimal damage. Of the 3 with only basic modifications, 2 had suffered partial penetrations but remained operational. Only 1 had been disabled, not Scott's tank, thankfully, and even then the crew had escaped without serious injuries. The armor works, Harris concluded, studying the after-action reports. Not perfectly, but it's giving our crews the protection they need. Sherman nodded, professional pride mingling with profound relief. Project Steel Bullet was always about buying time, reducing vulnerability, while we develop more comprehensive solutions. He shared the news about Carter's advanced armor concept. The next generation upgrade will provide even better protection. As the tactical situation stabilized and Russian forces withdrew to their side of the border, Sherman received permission to visit the forward units and assess the performance of the armor upgrades firsthand. He traveled with a technical team to the assembly area where damaged tanks were being evaluated. Scott's tank was among them, its turret bearing the impact mark of a Russian Kornet missile. The outer armor layers were severely damaged, but the inner composite had held, preventing catastrophic penetration. Engineers were already documenting the impact patterns to refine future armor designs. As Sherman inspected the damage, Scott approached from where he had been debriefing intelligence officers. "They told me you were here," he said, removing his helmet. A smudge of soot marked his cheek, but he appeared otherwise unharmed. "Quite a morning." "Are you all right?" Sherman asked, maintaining professional composure despite his paternal concern. "Fine. Shaken up but intact." Scott gestured toward his damaged tank. "Your armor modifications saved my crew, Dad. The intel guys say it was a direct hit from one of their new Kornets. Without the upgrades," he left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Sherman nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. The project that had consumed him for months had just saved his son's life. All the sleepless nights, the political battles, the technical challenges, in this moment, they all found their validation. "We've got an even better armor package coming," he said finally. Carter's advanced concept tested at 92% effectiveness. Scott smiled slightly. "Maybe hold that thought until after my next deployment." Father and son stood silently for a moment, the shared understanding between them transcending the need for words. Then Scott's radio crackled with orders to rejoin his unit, breaking the moment. "I need to get back," he said, replacing his helmet. "They're rotating us to a reserve position while they assess the tactical situation." "Of course." Sherman extended his hand. "Take care of yourself and your crew, Lieutenant." Scott took his father's hand, then in a momentary break with a military protocol, pulled him into a brief embrace. "Thanks for everything, Dad." As Sherman watched his son return to his unit, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in Scott's performance under fire, gratitude that the armor had protected him, and a renewed determination to complete the mission of Project Steel Bullet. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was General Maxwell. "Frank, I've just been briefed on the engagement. The armor performed exactly as you predicted." "Yes, sir. We've had 8 tanks hit by the new Russian weapons. 7 survived, 5 with minimal damage, 2 with moderate damage but still operational. Only 1 disabled, with the crew safely evacuated." "That's the best news I've heard all day." Maxwell's voice carried genuine relief. "The Secretary and the President have been briefed as well. You've been authorized to implement the advanced armor concept immediately. The Lima plant has already begun retooling." "Colonel Carter's design is remarkable," Sherman acknowledged. 92% effectiveness in final testing. "Outstanding. And Frank," Maxwell paused, "I understand your son's tank was among those hit. Is he all right?" "Yes, sir. The basic modifications prevented catastrophic damage." "Thank God for that." Maxwell's voice softened momentarily. "You've done extraordinary work, Captain. Not just for the Army, but for every tank crew who will benefit from these protections. The Secretary has authorized me to inform you that upon completion of Project Steel Bullet, you'll be promoted to Major and given your choice of assignments for the remainder of your career." Sherman hadn't expected recognition, much less promotion. At 58, with retirement looming, rank advancement had ceased to be a motivating factor. But the acknowledgement of his team's work meant something. Thank you, sir. But the credit belongs to the entire Steel Bullet team. Carter, Donovan, Blackwood, Foster. Their innovation and dedication made this possible. They'll all receive appropriate recognition, Maxwell assured him. For now, I need you to oversee the rapid deployment of the remaining comprehensive upgrades to all forward units. Then return to Aberdeen to supervise implementation of the advanced concept. Understood, sir. We'll get it done. In the months that followed, Project Steel Bullet transformed from an emergency response to a sustained program of armor improvement across the entire American tank fleet. The comprehensive upgrade was completed for all deployed units within 60 days. Carter's advanced armor concept entered full production, with the first tanks receiving the new configuration within 3 months. The diplomatic fallout from the border incident resulted in renewed negotiations and eventually a de-escalation of tensions. Russian forces withdrew to their normal garrison positions, their attempt to demonstrate armor superiority having backfired. Rather than showcasing their anti-tank capabilities, they had instead revealed the resilience of American armor and the speed with which vulnerabilities could be addressed. 6 months after the border incident, Sherman stood in the assembly building at the Lima Army Tank Plant, watching as the 100th Abrams tank with the advanced armor configuration rolled off the production line. Beside him stood Colonel Carter, now the program director for ongoing armor development, and Lieutenant Scott Sherman, recently promoted and selected to test the next generation of tank improvements. "What do you think?" Sherman asked his son, gesturing toward the newly completed tank with its distinctive armor configuration. Scott studied the vehicle with a professional eye. "It's impressive. The non-uniform geometry makes sense once you understand the physics involved." He glanced at Carter. "Colonel Carter's design is revolutionary." Carter smiled slightly, accepting the compliment with characteristic professional restraint. "The next iteration will be even better. We're incorporating lessons learned from the border incident to further enhance protection." As they walked around the massive vehicle, Sherman reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as an emergency response to a critical vulnerability had evolved into a comprehensive program that would ensure American armor superiority for decades to come. More personally, the project had reconnected him with his son in ways he hadn't thought possible. Their shared experience, Sherman developing the armor that ultimately saved Scott's life, had bridged the distance that had grown between them since Lisa's death. Now they spoke regularly, their conversations a blend of professional respect and rekindled paternal bonds. Scott had even begun dating again, a military historian named Julia who specialized in armored warfare. "You'd like her, Dad," he had said during their last call. "Reminds me a bit of Rebecca, smart, insightful, doesn't put up with military nonsense." The mention of Rebecca had prompted Sherman to finally accept her dinner invitation upon his return to Washington. Their relationship was developing slowly but steadily, two mature individuals finding unexpected connection amidst the demands of their respective careers. "Ready for the ceremony?" Carter asked, interrupting his thoughts. Sherman nodded. Today marked the official completion of Project Steel Bullet's initial phase and the transition to ongoing armor development under Carter's leadership. The Secretary of Defense would be attending, along with congressional representatives and senior military leaders. As they moved toward the ceremony area, Sherman caught sight of Maxwell speaking with a group of officials near the podium. The general spotted him and walked over. "Frank, the hour of triumph," Maxwell greeted him warmly. "How does it feel to see your project completed?" "Satisfying, sir, but the work continues under Colonel Carter's capable leadership." Maxwell nodded. "Indeed, and your new assignment as the Armor Center's Director of Combat Development will ensure the lessons from Steel Bullet inform all future tank designs." He lowered his voice slightly. "The President sends his personal thanks, by the way, not just for the technical achievement, but for preventing what could have been a disastrous first engagement with these new Russian weapons." The ceremony proceeded with the expected speeches and acknowledgments. Sherman accepted his promotion to major with quiet dignity, more gratified by the recognition given to his team members than by his own advancement. Carter received the Legion of Merit for her innovative armor designs. Donovan, Blackwood, and Foster all received appropriate honors for their contributions. As the formal proceedings concluded, Sherman found a moment alone with Scott before his son departed for his new assignment in Germany. "Proud of you, son," he said simply. both for your performance in combat and for where you're headed. Scott nodded, comfortable now with his father's praise in a way he hadn't been before the project brought them together. I learned from the best, Dad, not just tank tactics, but what it means to truly serve, to put mission and people above everything else. Your mother would be proud too, Sherman added softly. She always said you had the heart of a protector. Scott smiled at the memory. I miss her, but I'm glad we found our way back to each other, Dad. Me too, son, me too. As they parted, Scott to his new unit, Sherman to his new leadership role, they did so not just as father and son, or even as fellow officers, but as men who had faced mortality together and emerged stronger. The Steel Commander and his son, linked by blood, duty, and the armor that had saved one's life through the other's determination. The tanks would continue to evolve. New threats would emerge, requiring new protections. But the core lesson of Project Steel Bullet would endure. Innovation driven by necessity, leadership forged in crisis, and the unbreakable bond between those who build the shields and those who carry them into battle.